Welcome to Power Talks with Santosa. Today we have with us Mr. Richard Bennett, the representative of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights in Nepal. Human rights abuses and violations take place in every nation and societies. However, every individual on earth deserves and cares for one's dignity and justice. Mr. Richard, can you explain in simple words, why does a society need human rights?
Human rights are inherent in every human being from the moment they are born until they die. In order to fulfill these human rights, governments have certain duties that they have agreed to at the international level and at the local level. Human rights goes way back in history and is pretty common in most cultures and societies. For example, I think there is a lot of respect for human rights illustrated in Hindu texts. But the modern phase of global human rights arose from the ashes of the Second World War with the formation in 1945 of the United Nations. And the Charter of the United Nations includes respect for the human rights and dignity of every individual. 3 years later, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was proclaimed by all the member states of the United Nations.
It's very real that in developing nations, the concept of human rights feels like it's an imported concept, the way probably the human rights offices function. How do we explain that it's actually a local product?
In fact, sometimes it's said that it was the Western states that developed the Universal Declaration. There were around 18 drafters, countries that drafted on the drafting committee of the Declaration. And I checked on this, and only about 6 of the 18 were Western states. Amongst the other 12 were both China and India. And I notice as well that the suggestion for the Universal Declaration for Human Rights actually came from Cuba. So there is perhaps a lot of misunderstanding about the universality of human rights. But it's about universal values. And sometimes when I'm asked whether the rights are Western, I might reply with another question. Well, which of the 30 articles in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights do you disagree with? Do you think that the right to life is for one group or another, or is it universal? The right not to be tortured, the right to education or to health. So this is the promise of human rights. That it is established for all humanity, that they are a set of universal standards, and that while they are established by common agreement at the international level, the responsibility for delivering those rights is at the national level.
You have served as the representative of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights in Afghanistan. How do you view their status, and how has your experience been, both in terms of difficulties and success there?
Well, every country is different, and I've tended to work in countries which have been facing serious problems with human rights, and often with conflict and post-conflict situations. In Afghanistan, I think what I learned most from that situation was that there was an opportunity to move forward to improve human rights in Afghanistan, and it was missed. And the reason that it was missed was that some very powerful warlords who were weak at one point were allowed to regain strength because there was a culture of impunity and there was no accountability. I think the second lesson that I learned from Afghanistan is that, as in every country really, The major victims of human rights are those people and groups who are most marginal, who are the poorest, who are often women or children. And what we see today in Afghanistan is unfortunately a lot of fighting and conflict, but it's those vulnerable groups that are suffering most.
Post-conflict in Nepal, we have a similar situation right now where the culture of impunity has arisen and there is no rule of law. How do you see that?
I see, and my office sees, that the culture of impunity and the weakness in rule of law is critical to the long-term success of the peace process. Sometimes people tend to disconnect the past, the present and the future. But I see them going together, that there is a history of impunity, and impunity actually means an absence of consequences, and a lack of accountability. So when there is no system to bring about consequences for wrongdoing, for breaking the law, then people on one side begin to lose faith in the law, and on the other side, those who have broken the law or violated human rights feel encouraged. They feel immune from any consequences, and they are likely to continue and to do it again.
You've also worked in the same office in Sierra Leone and East Timor, yes, where the human rights violations have been on a very high scale. How was your experience working there?
Well, each country is quite different, and as I've said, I've tended to work in countries which have suffered from armed conflict and are recovering from that. My observation is that armed conflict damages societies beyond what you can see. It traumatizes individuals, and it very badly damages not only economies but the whole fabric of a society. And it's even worse when it is an internal armed conflict where people are fighting each other. In East Timor, it was more of a colonial, post-colonial type situation, because for 400 years East Timor had been a colony of Portugal, and then for a much shorter period, for about 27 years, it was a colony of Indonesia. And the conflict in East Timor was much related to another country, to Indonesia, the conflict that took place over a period of that 25, 27 years. In Sierra Leone, again, it was partly internal, partly external. Sierra Leone was a former British colony and was emerging from the effect of that colonialism, but it was also pressured by other countries. In particular, there is evidence that the neighbor Liberia had quite a lot to do with supporting the internal war in Sierra Leone. But one of the things I notice is that unless human rights is put at the heart of the recovery from a period of conflict, it's very likely that the conflict will break out again. You know, there are 3 pillars to the United Nations. One is peace, the second is development, and the third is human rights. And I often remember that former Secretary General Kofi Annan saying that you cannot have peace without development. You cannot have development without peace. And you cannot have either peace or development without human rights.